One of my favorite things about mixing are playing with the physical attributes of sound. Now, if you think about sounds you hear in the real world, rarely are we actually hearing the sound source. We're hearing the sound as it's affected by the environment that it's in. So if you're in a big room or a small room, what side it's coming at you from. There's a lot of things that go into shaping that sound before it actually hits your ears. Now, mixing is much the same thing, right? We have this 180-degree spectrum of sound. That's sort of the room that we're playing in, and we're trying to place all our instruments around the spectrum. You make them more in your face, maybe a little more distant, but that's a defined space that we're working in. Now, creating depth in a mix is a combination of factors. Like I said, it could be panning left and right, it could be loudness or volume, it could be EQ. There's a lot of things that go and work together to create depth in our mixes. Well, the brilliant people at JMG Sound, a part of the United Plugins umbrella, have brought that all together in one plugin called Expanse 3D. That's going to help you introduce that sort of third dimension of mixing, even in a stereo mix. Well, that's what I'm talking about today. I'm the Lonely Rocker. This is I Don't Have a Band, and welcome to my home studio. All right, let's jump into this. Now, the first thing that I want to do before we get too far is clear up any possible confusion. When we're talking about 3D and audio, some people might be thinking that this is some kind of 360 audio plugin or maybe some kind of binaural thing. That's actually a topic I have covered on my channel, so certainly you can dive into my channel and check that out. But what we're talking about here is depth within a stereo mix. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges if you really think about it. When you're mixing in stereo, you have two sound sources, right? You're listening to speakers, you've got a left speaker and a right speaker, or if you're on headphones, you have left and right. So the perception of width or even placement in between those two speakers, it's all an illusion, right? Anything that's happening in the middle, it's not like we have a speaker tattooed to our forehead. So it's a very careful relationship between what's happening between the left and right side of our mix to create the illusion of depth. Things close to us, things far away, things in the middle, and everything in between. And I think that's a big part of the fun and discovery when we're actually mixing in stereo. Now, Expanse 3D, what it does, it brings together a lot of those elements, those things that we use to create depth in the mix. Again, things like EQ, stereo width, but there's a lot of other things going on in here. And one thing that's really important to note, and I know, creating really wide mixes is a goal for many people who are mixing, and often they'll do their best within the mix and then they'll throw a stereo width plugin on their master bus. But you have to be really, really careful when you're trying to widen the stereo field, is that you could start creating phase issues, which is going to create all sorts of other problems, and be a real shame if you had a really good mix and you ruined it by just trying to widen it. So one thing that is built into this plugin is there is some phase correction. It's all taken into account, and to help you shape your tracks, just to have bigger sounding tracks or more depth in each individual track. And certainly you can throw it on your master bus just for that final little push to feel a little bit more width in your mixes. But like I said, with built-in phase correction, you can do that with a little bit more confidence. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm not going to talk too much now. Let's jump right in. I'm going to throw you some sound examples and demonstrate the plugin at the same time. And if you stick around a little later in the video, I want to peek under the hood a little bit if I can to really see what this plugin is doing. I mean, it's got three simple controls, and this is a non-conventional plugin. So, what it's describing through the plugin is not really telling us exactly what it's doing. So I want to see if I can try and understand and figure out what they're doing with this plugin. That's a little bit later, and also share with you my recommendations on where I think a plugin like this will be of use to you. All right, let's check out some samples. So before we jump into the first sound sample, very quickly, it's a pretty simple plugin. Just looking at it in terms of operating it, there's three main settings. You've got width, you've got depth, and you've got height. Now, width is pretty clear. We're thinking about stereo width, but we're going to try and understand a little bit better what depth and height are actually doing. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But underneath each one, you've got these sort of subsettings. With width, you've got normal, inverted. Depth has things like tight, normal, deep. So if we're thinking in terms of the shape of a sound, especially let's think about stereo width. Some instruments should live more in the middle, while some we want to feel wider or more on the outsides. So I guess each little subsetting under each knob here sort of helps you define the type of correction or adjustment that you want to apply to your track or your master bus. So a good way to customize it. Now, one thing I always say, and I sound like a broken record, but definitely check out the presets, especially with United Plugins, because they never shortchange you on presets, and it's really a great way to see what the developer is thinking and their suggestions. For example, throw this on your master bus. Let's take a look at their master bus setting to see, you know, how much width they recommend. And the fact that there is built-in phase correction, I think there's some kind of saturation, so they're bringing in some kind of harmonic content and psychoacoustic imaging, a lot of things going on that you're not actually controlling, but that's obviously tied to the algorithm and the adjustments that you make with the main knobs and sort of the subcategories. So what I typically do is I like to make my guitars really wide. I'll double track them and I'll pan them hard left and right. So what I've done is that I've bussed them so they're on one bus, and then I threw Expanse 3D on there to see if we can push this up a notch. And if you take a listen to it, you can really hear some clarity coming out on the edges of the mix, and overall they just sound clear and definitely sound a little bit wider. I'm going to show it to you in solo and in context. Let's take a listen. In this next example, I'm looking at some other guitars that I have here in the mix. These are the more effecty guitars. This is a really guitar-driven song. So instead of using keyboards, I created some, effects with guitars in that. So same thing, I've got two different guitar tracks that are bussed, and then using one plugin for the two instruments. If you look at the settings here, I've gotten 3/4 of the way up in the width, and I chose this alternate setting. It felt a little bit bigger to me. Depth, I guess if we're thinking in terms of a room, perhaps there's a little more sort of that acoustic imaging, maybe some delay, I don't know, maybe a little introduction of some kind of reverb. And then the height thing, I'm starting to think that is that's a kind of an EQ going on. I'm not exactly sure, but you've got high, you've got low and high. So I'm thinking perhaps they're doing some simultaneous boosts or cuts in the low and high end. We'll confirm that a little bit later. Let's take a listen. Now in this last example, I've thrown Expanse 3D on the master bus, and I have to say I really, really love what it's doing. And by the way, I did check it on a meter. I checked my phase and everything was solid. There was no issues. Now if you look at my settings here, I'm about maybe 1/3 of the way up the dial, sitting here about 10, 11 o'clock. A little bit of depth and height almost at noon. We're not overdoing it. All the settings are set to normal. Actually, the depth I've set to tight. It just sounded right to me. I mean, things happening in the middle. I want to be careful that I'm not widening them too much. We don't want the snare drum reverberating off to the sides of our mix, but I really, really like what this is doing. Take a listen. All right, let's take a look at the little laboratory here. So I want to figure out exactly what Expanse 3D is actually doing. And to do that, I'm going to use a spectrum analyzer. Now, actually, I did a video involved a sister company of United Plugins, that's Melda Productions, where I took a look at mixing with spectrum analyzers. I'm going to put a link in the description if you want to check that out. But that's really useful with any mix that you're doing to really understand what's going on. Especially in this case, we're going to take a look at the side and the mid information. Now, if you look at this graph here, everything in the green, that's everything in the middle of our mix. So everything happening up the middle, and the yellow here is all the information that's happening in the sides. So we can take a look at this graph as we play around with the parameters in Expanse 3D to understand what the plugin is actually doing. So if we start off with width, and by the way, I've got some pink noise here. I'll let you hear it on occasion, but I'm not going to drive you crazy. So with the width knob here at 0, let's start to crank it up and see what happens. Keep a close eye on the meter here. Okay, so now in stereo width, if we want something to sound wider, what that means is we want to hear more information on the outside of our mixes. So that by definition is the sides. So if you take a look here, as I crank up the width knob, you can see that yellow starting to increase. That means more information is starting to happen on the sides of our mixes. So it feels a lot louder on the outside, and that gives that perception of a wider mix. Now, if we push it too much, if I go here, see this starts to go into the red, that means we're going to have some phasing issues and things like that. So we would never want to push it that high. So let's roll it back. But actually, if I use one of their presets, I mean, I am on a pink noise here, but let's go to master. And if you notice looking at our meter that there's no issues with any phase, the relationship between the side and the middle frequencies here are perfect. So the adjustment that's recommended by the plugin is not adding any issues to our mix, and you can see it clearly here, no issues at all. So let's crank this up just for effect. I wouldn't typically go this high, but I want to hear what it's doing. Now I'm going to play with the depth here. Actually, let's crank this back down here. So to my ear, there's some kind of DSP processing happening there. Perhaps they're utilizing some room effects, maybe a little bit of delay, or just some kind of ambient effects to create a sense of depth in the room. That's what it sounds like to me. I'm pretty confident about that. So taking that stereo width, deciding how much more information we want to introduce on the sides of the mix that will determine how wide the signal sounds. And then we can start to add some depth by creating, I think if you're using a reverb or a delay, you're creating some shape or creating some, an environment, your feeling of environment. So that sounds, looks like what the depth knob is actually doing. So what is height actually doing? Let's check it out. Okay, so I've got it set to normal here. Now, if you look at our graph, we seem to be getting an EQ boost now at around the upper registers, sort of 10K. It looks like a little roll off on the top end. And then there's another little boost happening here around 60 hertz. Let's just confirm that. Now, you can see that on the graph. So what this is a clever EQ curve where, we've set our width, we've played with our depth to create some shape and space, and now using a very interesting EQ curve, a little sort of gentle boost in the high end and the low end simultaneously. Now let's see what these other settings do, because we've got low and high, so I assume we're going to get an extra boost on the bottom end. Maybe that's extreme, I don't know. Yeah, so you can see while we are making adjustments to the top end, it's a little more subtle, but we're getting a bigger boost on the bottom end. And I assume the opposite would be true if we set this to high. Yeah, we're getting a little gentle nudge on the low end and a more of an extreme boost in the higher registers. And then low and high, I assume it'll do the top and bottom maybe a little more than normal. There we go. Actually, if I just switch between the two, go to normal. So it's pretty complex, a lot more complex than trying to figure it out and then just using a standard EQ. There's a lot of things going on here at once. The stereo width, how much information on the sides that we want to bring in while maintaining some phase correction, which is really, really important. The depth, that's where I think the psychoacoustic imaging comes in with the plugin. That's all being controlled with the depth knob. And then the height is giving us an interesting EQ curve, a little low end, high end boost, creatively blending those in. All those three working together, plus with the built-in, some saturation and other things that are built in under the hood, is a really interesting combination of settings to really add the depth that we seek. Very, very clever, and something that would be very hard to replicate. It would take you at least 3 or 4 plugins to even try and replicate this, so very convenient to have them all here in one plugin. So after playing with this plugin for a bit, it's pretty clear to me where a plugin like this is really going to help you. Now, the best way for me to describe it, it's like an extra gear in your car. You've kind of taken as far as you can go and you want to just kind of go up one more. Well, that's where Expanse 3D is really going to shine. Now, no one plugin should be there to fix all of your issues. I mean, I don't believe in throwing a stereo width plugin on my master bus just to make my mix sound wider. That's just going to create all sorts of issues. You want to keep practicing, get better and better, know how to place all of your instruments and create as wide a mix as you can just with standard mixing practices. But then something like Expanse 3D can step in and just really push it up that one more notch just to make it sound really, really great. It has a great effect on all sorts of different instruments. I just showed you a couple here, and certainly the effect that it has on the master bus. And as I showed you with my little analysis there's a number of things that it's doing at once that are all working together. I mean, you could try and do it with a mid-side EQ, some reverb, and all sorts of things, but they're not going to be interacting together. So it's a very cleverly designed. It's a very, very simple interface to use, and use wisely. And like I said, definitely look at presets. I think it's a great way to see how the developer intended the plugin to be used, and then you can build your own presets from there. But it's really, really clever, really impressed how this is designed. And you know what? Don't just take my word for it. United Plugins does offer free trials on all of their plugins. So I'm going to put a link in the description. Make sure to check it out. If you do, let me know what you think. Always happy to hear from you. But a great plugin, guys. I'm definitely looking forward to using this plugin even more. Well, if you like this video, hopefully you'll check out some other things that I'm doing on this channel. I got tons of content. I've been linking them in the top corner. There'll be recommendations at the end of the video, so hopefully you'll check something else out. If you're new to the channel, I hope I've earned the subscribe. I've got a ton of content on this channel, a lot of it revolving around this home studio, geared to the home studio enthusiast and the home recording musician, with videos to hopefully help make your home studio life better. So perhaps you'll click that subscribe button and come along for the ride. If you really want to support this channel, I am on Patreon. Links to everything I've discussed and some things I haven't are in the description below. And above all else, hope I'll see you again in another video. As always, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. And please like, subscribe, and ring that bell to stay up to date. Remember, you don't need a band to rock and roll. There are a lot of great musical projects you can do by yourself, right from your own home. I hope to see you again next time.